Okay, so it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome to Stockton Professor Thomas Kuhne, who was and is a model for me, and I know for others, of a scholar and a teacher. Professor Thomas Kuhne taught the first course that I took as a doctoral student at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University in 2007 on racial thought and body politics. And from then on, he helped me to understand what it is that I actually am interested in and what I would like to research in the history of the Holocaust and more broadly about genocide and mass violence in the 20th century. So hosting you, Thomas, here where I work and teach is truly an honor and a pleasure. Professor Kuhne is the director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, where he holds the Strassler Chair in Holocaust History. His current research inquires into the cultural history of war and genocide with a focus on 20th century Germany, on Nazi perpetrators and bystanders, and on masculinities and the construction of collective identity through mass violence. One of the important insights of your work concerns, indeed, the constructive nature of genocidal violence in the minds of perpetrators, the making of their world through the destruction of the world of others. I find this insight central if we aim not just to be shocked by genocide, which is our usual reaction, but really to understand this modern form of violence and its meaning in the world around us today, and actually mean this quite literally in our societies. Professor Kuhne has been awarded for his scholarship and research a number of prestigious fellowships from the John Seaman Guggenheim Memorial Foundation in 2010. He was also twice a fellow in the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton University. Professor Thomas Kuhne wrote without end books, articles. He's authored a number of single monographs, quite recently, The Rise and Fall of Comradeship, which is on sale here for $20 and a discounted price. His previous book in 2010, Belonging in Genocide, Hitler's Community, 1918-1945. He's co-edited a number of volumes, most recently Globalizing Beauty, Body Aesthetics in the 20th Century, and in 2011, The Holocaust and Local History. In addition to that, and because of his recognition as a scholar in the field and your contribution to what we know about the Holocaust, about genocide, about the nature of mass violence, about the topics that you work on, Thomas is on the editorial board of a number of scholarly journals and on the executive board of the German Studies Association. Lastly, but by no means least, and anyone who works in the academic world knows how this last issue that I want to finish with in this introduction is important and time-consuming, and really at the core of what we do. Thomas is currently advising as the primary dissertation advisor of no less than 8 doctoral students, with a number of students who have already finished their doctoral dissertation under your supervision. So it's really a particular pleasure and honor to have you here with us, Thomas. I look forward to your talk. I think we'll have a very interesting event and to the discussion afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas Kuhne.
Ras, this is a wonderful introduction. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you and your colleagues for inviting me. Thank you all for coming and for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. It is a pleasure, not least, because indeed, I mean, Ras has has been always, since he came to Clark, and then he left, okay? But at the time he was with us, and since then, I mean, the model of a PhD student of our program. So, I mean, we are particularly proud of him, but we are also very, very proud in the same way of Adara Goldberg. Where is she now? She's disappeared. Ah, okay. So 2 of our students here, I mean, that's really, it's, that is a particular pleasure for me to see you here and to be here. So thank you for inviting me. My talk. PTSD was acknowledged some 35 years ago in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Since then, the rate of American veterans has gone up. Half of American, Iraq, and Afghanistan veterans apply for permanent disability, and roughly a third of these are diagnosed with PTSD. What can be done? Instead of therapizing the veterans, popular authors, journalists, and politicians like Sebastian Junger, one of those writers, suggested recently we should rather cure civilian society. According to Junger, it is, I quote from an article in Vanity Fair a while ago, the enormous chasm between military and civilian society in this country, the US, that is responsible for the homecoming soldiers' readjustment problems. Returning home, American soldiers, quote again, miss the war because it was finally an experience of human closeness that they can't find back home. Not the closeness of family, which is rare enough, but the closeness of community and tribe, end of quote. PTSD of former soldiers then is not only the result of the loss of the intense connectivity in war, it is also the result of the civilian society's lack of appreciation of what the soldiers went through. This, the relation between civilian society and war, is the subject of my talk, and more largely the idea that war, the epitome of destruction, engenders a type of solidarity and humanness that civilian society is missing. The band of brothers, forged in blood, as Shakespeare famously called it. My focus is Germany, not America, and I will be talking about how this special humanness in war informed one of the most inhuman wars at all, the Nazi War of Annihilation in the East from 1939 to 1945. I began my research under the impression of current German society's view on comradeship, which sharply contrasts to Junger's American view. German society has been demonizing the brotherhood of blood as a hotbed of evil, not of humanness. This is only a recent development that started in the 1980s and gathered momentum in the 1990s, this demonization of comradeship or brotherhood, the brotherhood in war. Earlier, especially before and during the Nazi period, and for 3 decades afterwards, brotherhood in war, or comradeship, was glorified in Germany just the way Americans do it often now. My basic argument is, and that is what I want to elaborate on as an exploration into the fabric of this closeness and humanness of that the soldiers develop in war. My basic argument is that comradeship, brotherhood in war, drew, and some regards still today draws, its power from reconciling or blurring the boundaries between opposites. Comradeship meant harmonizing different personalities, different positions, different identities, different emotions, and different capabilities. It did so in three regards. As the gold standard of male sociability, comradeship negotiated between toughness and tenderness. As a moral category, comradeship blurred the boundaries between good and evil. And finally, comradeship reconciled face-to-face groups, communities, small communities, and large, anonymous social entities like the society or the nation. Now, to understand a bit better what comradeship in Germany was about, one has to know that the German discourse on face-to-face relations distinguishes comradeship from the concept of friendship. Friendship caters to the individual self. It is rooted in mutual sympathy of individuals, and it may be quitted at any time. It is a chosen relationship. Comradeship, by contrast, radiates destiny, fate, the lack of agency. It denotes the relationship of people who cooperate, work and live together not by choice, but by orders, by accident, or by fate. They must stick together until the vital task is done or the lethal danger averted. Comradeship is the solidarity of a community of fate, not of choice. It is this aura of fate and destiny that originated comradeship's popularity in Germany in the age of total wars, the first half of the 20th century. Ultimately, comradeship and the ideology about it commands the sacrifice of the self on behalf of the nation or the platoon. This way, it is morally loaded, although in a specific way. Let's look at one of the crucial prerequisites of the Third Reich, the way Germany remembered its First World War. The most significant piece of German World War I collective memory was Erich Maria Remarque's best-selling novel All Quiet on the Western Front, published in 1929 in Germany, and put into a movie in America, by the way, in 1930, which became very popular in Germany as well. In a key scene, the hero or anti-hero, Paul Bäumer, a German private and still a kid in this novel, and a soldier in war, Paul Bäumer hides in a bombshell hole under fire when a French soldier jumps in. Paul, just not even graduated from high school, spontaneously stabs him, the French, but he cannot leave the hole due to ongoing shooting outside. And these are stills from the movie. Now, Paul is facing his slowly dying enemy victim and appreciates his humanness, the enemy's humanness. And that makes him feel guilty. And Paul asks the enemy, although already dead, for forgiveness. As you know, a crucial concept of Christian morality. Quote from the novel, "Comrade, I did not want to kill you. Forgive me." Eventually, Paul gets out and hurries to his comrades. They, and that is the point of the story, immediately take care of him. Back with his comrades, Paul feels relief. Quote again, "I listen to them and feel comforted, reassured by their presence. It was mere driveling nonsense that I talked out there in the shell hole. End of quote. The point here is comradeship, so back with his comrades, comradeship entails emotional comfort and care, but it does much more. It establishes a collective morality that replaces the morality of guilt felt by Bäumer as an individual in that hole. Being back home with his comrades, Paul overcomes the guilt feelings he had when he killed the French. In other words, comradeship relieves of individual responsibility and guilt feelings. The group takes over responsibility and diffuses the sense of individual guilt. Communities of comrades, resigned to their fate, neutralize the moral burden of their aggression toward those outside of the community through altruism and harmony within. That's the bottom line. This image shows an altar piece titled Comradeship that was unveiled at the Veterans Reunion in 1925 in the German town of Constance, at the Lake of Constance. A youthful soldier, as you see here, mourns his fallen comrade, holding his head tenderly, creating an island of humanity amid the deserts of inhumanity. This altar piece is a variation of the Pietà, of course. It reenacts St. John's Gospel that says, quote, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." Beyond and in addition to this moral complexity, comradeship also meant for a diverse group of men, the typical social condition of drafted mass armies in the 20th century in Europe, to put aside conflicting civilian identities, their ties to social classes, racial identities, religious affiliations, ideological belief systems. And this remark novel, high school students or graduates, as well as working class guys, and lots of other men work closely together and experience and produce that sense of comradeship. That is a recurrent theme in German First World War memory. These men throw away or overcome their civilian identities and adopt a new sense of belonging as soldiers, as soldier men, to be more precisely. Instead of civilian hierarchies and identities, new bonds and distinctions emerged, a nuanced set of masculine standards that replaced the life-saving morality of civilian society by the martial morality of death, of killing and getting killed. Influential scholars have argued that military masculinity and masculinity at large is defined by the repudiation of femininity. Manly is the opposite of feminine. By the repudiation of femininity, meaning whatever is attributed to females and female behavior, such as domesticity, tenderness, and compassion. My view on male bonding of soldiers leads to a different conclusion. To be sure, comradeship as the epitome of male bonding and the fabric of masculinity, the social fabric of masculinity, on the one hand, was the army's moral machine to spur aggression, tough masculinity, heroism. It was supposed to guarantee fighting morale and to execute conformity before and during the battle. A good comrade would not stay behind, but run into the battle together with, with his comrades. This way, comradeship endorsed heroic, tough, aggressive masculinity, hard concepts of manhood, including decisiveness, control over others and oneself. The comrade, again, was the one who stormed with the crowd into the battle instead of staying behind. But this is only half of the picture. The soldier's routine of social interaction, as well as the exceptional experience of the battlefield, allowed for or even demanded the display of femininely coded affection, tenderness, empathy, caring, and tolerance toward emotional breakdowns, moments or periods of weakness. Soldiering provided men a male identity that eventually was not defined by repudiation of femininity, but by integration of femininity, or what usually is coded as feminine. This way, it allowed men to experience themselves as whole human beings in a way that indeed seemed not possible in civilian lives. What eventually counted for being considered a member of the all-male society was the ability to enliven its social dynamic and social cohesion. This could be done in rather different ways: by demonstrating heroism on the battlefield, by rescuing wounded comrades from the battlefield, or, for instance, by organizing sentimental Christmas parties afterwards. An inclusive concept of soldierly masculinity allowed rather different types of soldiers, personalities, to establish male identities, to assure them their own masculinity, manliness. And this, as I like to call it, protean fabric of masculinity also allowed individual men to switch between different emotional and moral states without losing their male identity. This way, the concept of comradeship built bridges over diverging experiences and eventually advised men how femininity and masculinity, tenderness and toughness could be on good terms with one person, one man. It was this protean concept of manliness and the notion of comradeship as a gold standard of male interaction that governed the emotional and moral roller coasters of German soldiers in the Second World War even more than in the first one. And it did so not despite, but because of the genocidal dimensions of the Second World War. A comrade was someone with whom, quote, you could get up to something now and then, end of quote. That's the way the German Lieutenant Gerhard Modersen put it in his diary in 1943. For countless soldiers, getting up to something together meant one thing above all: adventures with women. Modersen was married, but it was precisely adultery, which along with his comrades he constantly practiced, which for him represented the attraction of life as a soldier. And this was not only a matter of sexual needs. At least as important was the ability to boast of sexual adventures to your circle of comrades. Showing off about sex was as much a part of assimilation into a community of male bodies as affectionate homoeroticism, as in this picture at the Christmas camaraderie. Both demonstrated the social sovereignty of the leagues of males, their independence from real independence or superiority over real women, also their superiority over the family and the home, more largely over civilian society and civilian rules. The moral grammar of comradeship always obeyed the same rule: anything was allowed that enriched and intensified the group's social life. Raids against the subjugated civilian population in the East brought some variety to the dreariness of everyday life, not unlike the fighting against military enemies, and not unlike chasing women or boasting with sexual adventures. In the spring of 1943, Lieutenant Werner Gross and his men rode with horses and coaches as they ransacked villages, combed woods, and cleared the area of bands, as he proudly wrote in a letter to his parents. Bands was the Nazi word for partisans, and in the Nazi propaganda and ideology, these bands of partisans equaled Jews. We lived, wrote Gross, like gypsies and vagabonds. These cleansing operations provided the comrades, in other words, with an invigorating magic potion, a social awareness that they were elevated above the morals of civil society as well as international war laws. Once back with their units, the soldiers resorted to tender, motherly, family-like comradeship to fight depression and deprivations and to enjoy homoeroticism in an all-male society. Just as at home with mom, noted a soldier at a Christmas party on the Eastern Front. Further quote, harmonica, fiddle, singing, happiness, and everything is done together. And we all felt so emotional. Some became teary-eyed. End of quote. The soldiers were ending this party with a bottle of champagne when a bomb hit the bunker. Quote again, 1 dead and 4 casualties. I can't help the one who died, noted the writer, a doctor. Those who survived moved even closer together. Death fueled comradeship. Terror generated tenderness. For some soldiers, comradeship fueled aggression toward enemies, including civilians and genocide. For other soldiers, comradeship represented the humanness they no longer found anywhere else amid this criminal war. Comradeship meant, again, harmonizing and merging different personalities, different positions, different identities, different emotions, and different capabilities. As such, in this harmonizing function, comradeship reached way beyond the specific group they practiced. Instead, in Germany, since the First World War, this concept of comradeship served as a model for renewing and reorganizing the entire civilian society, the nation. Since the First World War, frontline comradeship in Germany was hailed as a model to deliver the fatherland from the evil of inner disruption, from class conflicts and so on. Comradeship served as a model to establish a truly united nation, or Volksgemeinschaft, people's community as it was called. Class conflicts and other cleavages in Germany had climaxed during the First World War and impeded the German democracy even more in the 1920s. By contrast, the veterans of the First World War in the 1920s claimed that the Front Army, they, had bridged these cleavages and overcome the class gaps of civilian society through trench comradeship. Before the Nazis took over power in the 1920s, this discourse on comradeship included the idea of interracial and interethnic brotherhood. It brought Jewish and Gentile soldiers together, at least occasionally, although anti-Semitism gathered momentum and questioned inclusive comradeship. The racist foundation of the Nazi state from 1933 on no longer allowed for such inclusion. The Nazis pushed for a racially exclusive redefinition of comradeship as a vehicle of a purely Aryan Volksgemeinschaft or people's community under the unconditional command of Hitler. A famous visual take of this Aryan concept of comradeship is the supernatural statue by Josef Thorak from 1937, here on the left. As the dictionary, a few years later, explained, in the Third Reich, comradeship had become the code word for, I quote, unconditional belief and obedience that merged Adolf Hitler's allegiance into an indissoluble and irrevocable community, end of quote, meaning a community of entirely Nazified soldiers and citizens. This understanding of comradeship, of course, was a Nazi ideal. Not all Wehrmacht soldiers, and the Wehrmacht recruited 17 million German soldiers, most of them against their will. They were drafted into the army and drawn from all parts of the German society. Not all of these soldiers agreed to this concept, this racist and totalitarian concept of comradeship, just as they didn't agree on the Nazi genocidal project. Different soldiers honored different meanings of comradeship. Among comrades, observed the Wehrmacht private Jochen Klepper, in August 1941 at the Eastern Front, I quote, "Different opinions are openly discussed. It is the uniform that allows diversity." End of quote of this soldier. Now to this guy, Jochen Klepper, this comradely diversity meant the world. In the Third Reich, he was tolerated as a popular Christian and military rider for a while, but only to eventually yet being ostracized, not because his Christian values, but because he was married to a Jewish woman. For a while, the army seemed to be safe from the totalitarian goals of the Nazi dictatorship. In the army, I quote again from Klepper's diary, German men still got along apart from all partisanship issues. Klepper enjoyed, for instance, deep nightly talks with a, I quote again, very sensible, warm-hearted and bright young man, although, end of quote, although, or in a way because this young man was a member of the SA, meaning a dedicated Nazi. But diversity and inclusion came with one crucial limitation, as also Klepper realized. I quote again, "I can freely talk to anybody about everything, but not about the Jewish question. I always see that propaganda has been almost completely successful. Nobody questions it. The Jews have to go," Klepper noted in the autumn of 1941, before being discharged from the army due to his Jewish wife, and soon after a couple of months later, they committed suicide, both of them, together with their child. The more the war and the genocide went on, the more this beautiful human touch, as Klepper called it, of all the talks with comradeship, gave way to the flip side of comradeship, the norm to go with the crowd. Group pleasure, in other words, gave way to group pressure. Comradeship could allow for ideological diversity and some sort of tolerance, and yet it was a virtue of conformity, the morality of the bystander. Comradeship demanded to join in, to conform, to do what everyone else did, and to look the other way, not least when it came to criminal warfare. In the early years of the war in the East, German soldiers might do so because of the initial grand victories, and they may suffocated pangs of conscience about their own entanglement in genocidal war. In the later period of the war, fears of revenge by the enemies for what the Germans had done, enemies the real and the imagined ones, actuated guilt feelings. This made the soldiers escaping into a state of fatalism, a couldn't-care-less attitude in which the fight till the bitter end seemed to be the only option left. Out there, said a soldier to his family in 1943 before returning to the Eastern Front, quote, "You don't think much about what all that murder is good for. You are with your comrades and you do your duty, that's it." End of quote. Many soldiers may have worn a mask of conformity, meaning they conformed but inwardly may have disagreed with what was going on. They may have even been embarrassed privately among themselves about genocidal warfare. But eventually, they all stuck together and worked together. Eventually, it was not the masked self, but the mask, conformity, that determined the choices the soldiers made and the actions they performed, whether they laughed at sexist jokes or terrorized enemy civilians. What remained was a sinister comradeship fueled by the virtue of sticking it out together. This sticking it out became the paradigm of masculinity at the end of the war and beyond. A stoic, resilient, indestructible concept of manliness made the German soldiers keep fighting till the end of the Second World War. And in post-Nazi, post-World War II Germany, their remembrance of their suffering in war and their stoicism in enduring all the pain allowed the former soldiers to remain silent about the criminal dynamic of the war they had fought, and yet to celebrate the manliness they had demonstrated on the fields of death. This was no longer an aggressive manliness, but a defensive one, entrenched in the experience of suffering, sacrifice, and defeat that had always steered the construction of military masculinity. Comradeship in war had been spurred by breaking the morality of the humanness of civilian society. At the same time, practicing comradeship had also meant to maintain islands of humanity amid inhumanity, cynicism, killing, and murder. This Janus phase of comradeship became essential after 1945. Remembering the humanity they had practiced among themselves allowed the former soldiers to cleanse their consciences from the entanglement in the crimes against humanity. This way, Hitler's soldiers, or veterans, former soldiers, could present themselves as pioneers of the new, liberal, and peaceful democracy. A prominent West German politician explained at the veterans meeting in 1956, I quote, "Comradeship, mutual help, mutual commitment, which the soldiers demonstrated in the war and were again demonstrating in their meetings, their reunions, is," quote from this politician, "a part of the foundation on which the new state, the German democracy, was built, because the spiritual elements of the democratic state are respect, care, and concern for one another for the benefit of all." End of quote. From there, from this positive image of comradeship, it took a long time until the myth of purely human comradeship began to totter. This change started in the 1980s when members of the war generation retired. In this decade, younger people were taking over influential positions in politics, the economy, and the cultural sector, not least in schools, universities, and the mass media. Around 1990, this process of generational renewal was completed. Now, neo-Nazi activities, as well as hazing scandals and sex scandals in the present German army of the 1990s and 1980s, and respective cover-ups, were booked by the public on the account of an unconditional male and soldierly solidarity, comradeship, that is. At the same time, the Cold War came to an end and pacifist sentiments mushroomed in Germany. The Wehrmacht soldiers, then still active and alive, reacted to the rising power of pacifism by withdrawing from the public. They no longer would hold their meetings in public, being acclaimed by leading politicians, as they had done in the 50s, 60s, and still in the 1970s. But now they met privately rather than publicly. And this way, unwillingly, they established a cult of secrecy that only stirred up more and more doubts of their democratic reliability. Had they ever overcome the old Nazis? Or didn't they feed the neo-Nazis, like this book cover? This way, comradeship in Germany became symbolic of a subculture that represented the opposite of everything that civilian society held in high regard. What had held the myth of comradeship together until then, altruism and aggression, morality and immorality, broke apart. In America, by contrast, new epic war dramas, such as Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, 1998, or the TV miniseries Brand of Brothers, 2001, celebrated the brotherhood of combat gloriously. In fact, this American fascination with the brotherhood in war goes back to the late 1970s and the 1980s, precisely at that time when the decline of comradeship started in Germany. In America, Vietnam War movies and TV series depicted men, and back then it was only men, who embodied the patriotic quality of comradeship in war. In war, or more precisely in war movies, the Band of Brothers transcends what separates people in civilian society, including race. The soldiers in war make America, the melting pot conception of America, real through their comradeship, in the same way as they had done in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s. Today in America, enormously popular TV shows like NCIS, or Naval Crime Investigation Service, aired since 2003. In these shows, teams of special agents investigate crimes and restore order, do good, restore justice. And these guys, most of them, or many of them, in the movies, have served in the Gulf War, the Iraq War, or the Afghanistan War. These men, meanwhile occasionally supported by women, embody the principle of no one is left behind and reenact the morals of comradeship and prove its benefits for civilian society. The bonds of men hammered in war appear as a social tool to bring wrongdoers to justice, to fight evil, to do good, to heal civilian society, the American nation. Indeed, comradeship is a good thing, or it can be. It can also be an engine of evil, of genocide. We should be aware of its Janus face before we praise it. Thank you.
Right-ranging from World War I, the memory of World War I, into World War II, and the memory of World War II, and up to American popular culture. So, and I forgot to say before that actually one of the things that you've done in your career is also explored in detail the locating of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany within the history of the 20th century, both the continuities and discontinuities. So this, I think, talks to some of these issues and thinking about this history as an integral part of the 20th century in various ways. So with this, I open it to your questions, comments. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jason, and I am a finance major. I wanted to know how much do you put brainwash into the amount of comradeship, and does it have a large factor?
Brainwash the soldiers.
Yes, because you can come together to be the you can come come together for comradeship, but it's not always necessarily the case. Sometimes they use the propaganda or brainwashing to force the comradeship.
I wouldn't call it brainwash. I mean, brainwash means that you change the minds of people completely, yeah, within a relatively short time, and that is not what happened. Yeah, that is not what happened. I mean, that is what we can say as historians if we study private diaries of soldiers or private letters to, you know, letters between soldiers and their loved ones at homes or between comrades or so. And what these letters tell us is that soldiers either were fascinated with the army, with soldierly life and with soldiering even before they got into the army, because they had heard about it and learned about it, then there was no need for brainwashing, or they indeed adjusted. I mean, many soldiers, as I said, 17 million, I mean, a rough calculation would tell you that out of these 17 million who served under Hitler as drafted soldiers, yeah, as opposed to the SS or so, which were not drafted. These drafted soldiers, conscripted soldiers, mostly joined the army not voluntarily, yeah? And they did adjust. They had to, okay? I mean, otherwise they would have gotten lost. Or only very few were able to withstand the pressure to adjust. They did adjust. They changed parts of their ideas, views, attitudes, yeah, as part of this adjustment process, assimilation. But brainwash is really the wrong term, because brainwash means that, you know, you change your mind from black to white or the other way around or so, and that is what rarely happened. For instance, soldiers Wehrmacht soldiers who were drafted into the army, who in their civilian lives, who did have, I mean, civilian backgrounds that were at distance to the Nazi movement. For instance, with a background in this mostly social or social democratic or socialist working class in Germany, so anti-Nazi backgrounds, or backgrounds or with Catholic backgrounds in Germany. Also, I mean, Catholicism collaborated with the Nazis, yeah, as you probably know, but there was ideologically a huge gap, yeah. And these two milieus, the social democratic or socialist and the Catholic, made about two-thirds of the society in Nazi Germany. Soldiers with these backgrounds also did adjust and adopted parts of the Nazi ideology, in many cases including anti-Semitism, yeah? Parts. But usually they wouldn't give up entirely of their of the ideologies and ideas and mindsets they had owned before they entered the army. Does that answer the question?
Yes,
thank you. Hi, this isn't a question, it's more of kind of a statement. So we're talking about the positive aspect of the United States and comradeship, you know, like with Saving Private Ryan. My thing is, though, if you look at like Band of Brothers or Saving Private Ryan, it usually shows white males. And we know that the United States Army was segregated for a very long time. So I kind of feel like while there's a positive aspect to, you know, the camaraderie among, like in the United States, it also is negative in the aspect that it kind of creates a segregation among the citizens. Like, so you watch Band of Brothers, like, yeah, you know, this is just my opinion, that's a bunch of white guys, you know, they're all buddies, meanwhile the, you know, blacks are segregated, you know, so anyone who watches that, you know, they build this idea, so it kind of, but it also creates, I think, you know, it doesn't create a positive, like, idea of camaraderie among everybody.
That is absolutely true. No, I mean, I was talking about popular culture, movies, yeah? I mean, so that, not about the reality, yeah? And the reality is different. In the reality, and if you look to what German soldiers did and felt in terms of ethnic or racial gaps and how they were overcome, or American soldiers in the Second World War, Vietnam War, and beyond, then, I mean, you are right. But my point is that civilian society, I mean, so the movies and TV series I quoted, they are actually very popular. So, I mean, many people are fascinated with that. And they get a rather different picture. Yeah, I mean, so you are right.
How you doing? Now, at the end of your little thing, you said about the NCIS and the TV shows and how the camaraderie is shown in them because half of them are ex-military or whatever else. Now, in our current criminal justice system, many of our police officers, it's like upwards 30%, are ex-military vets themselves. Do you feel that camaraderie negatively affects some of the issues that we see in our criminal justice system in this country?
You could say so. I mean, as I try to explain, camaraderie is a hotbed for cover-ups, okay? I mean, cover-up is a crucial element of camaraderie, yeah? I mean, that's a certain understanding of solidarity, yeah? That's what makes cover-up, so that is true. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't leave it there, okay? Only pointing to these very problematic sides of comradeship. I mean, you would have to acknowledge that, I mean, for police to function, yeah, it needs a certain type of this kind of solidarity. So it is both, yeah? That is just how it is. The ambivalence is what matters, yeah? And we have to somehow deal with this ambivalence. That is what I think my job as a historian, or more largely as a scholar, is to explore and to make aware of this ambivalence that you cannot resolve, or you should not. I mean, I think it would be wrong to say comradeship per se is, or camaraderie is a bad thing, period. Yeah? It's just not that easy. It is both. However, maybe one more sentence on that. As you did draw the line from the fact that a large portion of the police today in this country has military experience. Yeah? I mean, I think it would be wrong to assume that there would be no camaraderie or so if police consisted only of former civilians, and if, I mean, former military would not join the police force. Yeah, then camaraderie would develop anyway. Maybe not in the same way, but I mean, more or less. That is just how such an organization, the police, which is not the same, which does not work and is not fabricated in the same way as a military, but I mean, there are many parallels and overlaps, so that is just what an organization like police or military in a way needs to function.
Mike, Amanda, Mary.
I'd like to ask a question specifically about sort of the genocidal impetus, if you will, and whether you see the comradeship as a sort of a tool or reality where the actual program, the genocidal program, is something that is more imposed on the situation, and then the sort of comradeship allows the participants to participate, to become essentially the executioners, the perpetrators, or whether there's something that is sui generis, that there's a self-generated sort of genocidal impulse that can emerge out of that comradeship.
No, I don't think that comradeship breeds genocide. Yeah, that's not the way I would put it. Comradeship factors in in that it facilitates and fuels genocide. Or to be more concrete, it allows people or makes people join in genocidal actions due to this entire cult of solidarity and conformity pressure and so on and so forth, which they might not have done otherwise as individuals. Yeah? So, I mean, my contribution to a, let's say, social history or sociology of genocide does not focus on the core group of perpetrators who can't wait killing people. It focuses on those, on what we often call, and maybe mistakenly, bystanders, the people who otherwise would not have become genocidaires, but whose one way or another support the genocide. Yeah?
Thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to kind of go off of that question a little bit. So I think camaraderie today, I know as kids we're always pushed to join a group, find your place, and then within that it breeds this whole, or it doesn't necessarily breed, but it does fuel or foster that whole us versus them. You can see it in sports teams, in classrooms, and things like that. So I like how you ended it with it can be used for good or it can be a vehicle for hate. What are some suggestions that you would give classroom teachers or sports coaches or anybody to kind of recognize when it's turning towards evil and what we can do to kind of rein it back in so that it can still be used for good? Because it can switch, I feel like, in a matter of seconds.
That is true. The latter, what you said at the end, that is true. And I have to tell you, I don't have the perfect recipe. Yeah, no, I don't. Because I cannot control all these different situations and groups and so on. Yeah? What I would say generically, what I think is important is, and that is actually what happens, yeah? That in these groups, which are not military and which do not operate hundreds or thousands of miles away from their families, their friends, from civilian society, but are, I mean, deeply rooted and interact with civilian society, with the rest of the society on a daily basis, yeah? I mean, a sports team or so, they are not separated from the rest of the society for weeks, months, or years, yeah? They go back in the evening or morning or whatever, yeah, to their families, to their friends and kids, yeah, you name it. And meaning they are subject to this kind of potentially dangerous camaraderie only for a couple of hours per day. For the rest of the day, they are still rooted in these individualized relationships, yeah? Whether, I mean, family bonds or friendships or so, friendship, which again is a chosen relationship. I mean, you like your friend and it's your friend because you like them. And if you don't like him at some point or them anymore, then you just split up, yeah? That is your choice. And that is a completely different type of relationship than comradeship, where you just are ordered, so this group has to, this platoon or whatever, or unit or police unit also has to stay together so and so long and do this and that. Yeah? So, the evil side, to put it this way, of comradeship can be countered, or is countered, the more their members stay rooted and connected to civilian society.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That is very interesting. I'm wondering if it sounds so much like it's the male part of at least the Nazi experience. Yeah. Is comradeship not something that, I remember Claudia Kuntz's work certainly talked about it with regard to women, but is that a very different kind of bonding, so to speak, that would really separate men and women even more in the society?
That's a very good question. I left that out because I I actually deal in my book with that or in other publications. I left it out because usually in this kind of talk, if it gets, gets longer than an hour or so, people get bored. So that's, I didn't want to misuse your patience. It's a very good question, and it actually did matter quite a lot for Nazi Germany. Already in the 1920s, but the Nazis in the 1930s kind of intensified, and in a way intensified the idea of comradeship among women and girls, and promoted that. Yeah, they also propagated a certain idea of comradeship between men and women. So comradeship, again, remember what I tried to explain, is a relationship soaked by fate. Yeah, I mean, it is goal-oriented, not oriented to the self. It doesn't serve the self. It serves a certain goal. And in the case of the Nazi state, comradeship of men and women, and that's the point, served to establish the racist nation that would be militarily strong and would be cleansed of, had defeated the racial enemy, the Jew. So that was the goal, yeah? And so in this sense, comradeship among women and earlier girls was propagated in the Nazis, by the Nazi state, and actually and kind of trained in various organizations. As you probably know, the Nazi state established a girls' league, I mean, in many regards close to, I mean, like Girl Scouts in America, but only so much. It also meant that girls would meet once a week, twice a week or so, and do sports and all kinds of funny things, yeah? And would go to summer camps or so for a couple of weeks. And actually, this did not serve to ideologically indoctrinate these girls, or not primarily, but it did serve to strengthen bonds of camaraderie among these girls and women. And strengthening these bonds of camaraderie among girls and women meant, directly or indirectly, to kind of separate them from their families, or to allow them to separate, or to pressure them. And you have to, again, as I said before, I mean, 2/3 of the Nazi society were still more or less rooted in Catholicism on the one hand, or in social democratic ideologies on the other hand. So that was a challenge for the Nazis, yeah? And they wanted to fight that. That is why they were interested in separating these girls from their private relationships, families, and so on. And in many cases, that actually did work out. So, I mean, diaries, which we as historians use to explore this part of the past, show that girls and women enjoyed this type of camaraderie. And they did it enjoy for a couple of reasons. I mean, you know, it's just, I mean, it's actually fun. Yeah? It is enjoyable in many regards. I mean, sport teams do it. I mean, so it is enjoyable. It's not, again, not entirely a bad thing. They did enjoy it. Not least because it made them feel like catching up with men. Yeah? I mean, you have to know, I mean, to understand, you know that probably, that at that time, there was not much of women's emancipation. Yeah? So this was a time period where 95% of women and girls had no idea about emancipation, what we call now emancipation, women's emancipation. And they experienced this kind of camaraderie as a liberation from traditional female roles. They experienced this, they wouldn't have called it that way, but they experienced it as a kind of emancipation, or more precisely as an empowerment. That's what the Nazis played with and used or misused, as we should say. And so it did matter, yes.
So although like soldiers might have disagreed like internally, but externally like assimilated and still acted out those acts, do you think that although they disagreed and might have like said that to others, like do you think that kind of takes away, like we're supposed to sympathize with them and not think of them as bad people because they disagreed, but they still, you know, carried out those acts, or they eventually also assimilated internally?
Both happened, yeah? Both happened. Some adopted during their time as soldiers over many years, okay, and you have to consider they were separated from their families over years. They would adopt parts of the Nazi ideology and racism even if they hadn't been affected by it before. So this did happen on a large-scale basis, no doubt, more or less. No? I mean, individuals react to the same kind of pressure and indoctrination in different ways, yeah? To different degrees and so on and so forth. Yeah? I'm not 100% sure whether I understand your question correctly. You mean whether that makes them better people if they did not assimilate inwardly but only outwardly?
Like if they say like they were just doing their job, but they didn't necessarily agree with it.
Well, that's a difficult. These soldiers, there were quite a lot of them. Yeah, that's what we know from diaries, from private diaries and private letters and so on. Yeah, there were quite a lot who disagreed inwardly, but conformed in the way they acted. Yeah, I mean, you have to consider that was practically the only way to get along. Yeah, I mean, you have to, this is an enormously difficult situation. Yeah, what do you do if you have nobody else to talk to? Only, you know, your platoon, your group you interact with on a daily basis, they are all Nazis, and you are not. What do you do? Yeah, that's a really difficult situation. Yeah, if you and you don't know when it ends. Yeah, I mean, if it was only a couple of months, you would think, okay, I stick it out, and somehow I get through it. But that was not the case with the soldiers, the Nazi soldiers in the Second World War. They didn't know when the war would end. Yeah, and whether they would ever get home. Yeah, so this is an extremely psychologically an extremely difficult situation, and that. Is what you have to consider. My job, I think, my job as a historian is not to judge over these people. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of useless. Yeah, I think. My job is to explain why this society and individuals acted the way they did. Yeah. Yeah, that's my answer. I think it is difficult, and you know, it's cheap for us now living in a you know, in an extremely liberal and free society. Yeah, to judge over people who did not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I know it's easier for us to judge that now, but
yeah.
Most of us would have been in a different mindset having been in that particular time.
Exactly.
Period.
So I mean, I was born and grew up in Germany. And so I did ask myself, I did ask myself, as I have been researching Holocaust perpetrators and bystanders and Germans in the Third Reich for 20 years or so, I sometimes catch myself wondering how I would have acted, what I would have done. Yeah? Okay, I mean, my father came from a social democratic family and my mother from a Catholic family, yeah? So not Nazified. But they were no heroes. I mean, these families were no heroes in Nazi Germany. Yeah? They somehow, you know, shut up. Yeah, that's as far as I was able to figure out. How would I have acted? Honestly, probably in the same way. Yeah, I'm afraid. Of course, I would rather fancy myself as the big resistor or so. But I mean, realistically. Probably it wouldn't have worked out that way.
We have one more question.
So I wanted to say thank you for coming, and I appreciate that you kind of tied it into the more modern awareness of PTSD and these issues of reintegration that we're kind of just starting to face as a society. And I was wondering what you kind of saw in terms of World War II for these Nazi soldiers who were coming back, because I know there was quite a stigma against anything to do with Hitler and the Holocaust in the immediate aftermath of the war. So I guess I'm kind of wondering what happened to this kind of brothership, and if you got any sense of, you know, where these people went in the immediate aftermath.
I have to correct the idea that there was that in the German post-war society, post-Nazi society, that there was that everyone would thrown at former Nazis or soldiers. Or the opposite was the case. Yeah? I mean, you have to consider that most, I mean, in the 1950s, those men or women who actually survived the war were still alive, and most of them, one way or another, had tried to get along with the Nazis, or actually were enthusiastic about. Yeah? There are opinion polls in the 1950s, 60s that showed that about 1/3 of the West German society, the East German couldn't be polled, yeah? But 1/3 of the West German society of these years, 1950s, 60s, basically stuck to their former Nazi ideas and thought, well, actually it wasn't so bad in the Third Reich. And 2/3 did not, whatever that may mean, yeah? But these 2/3 did not like perform openly and publicly anti-Nazism all the time. The opposite was true. They actually shut up, because they had shut up in the Third Reich as well. Yeah? They had no reason to now raise their voices. What does that mean for PTSD of former Wehrmacht soldiers at that time? Well, I have to tell you, we actually don't know. Unlike America after the Vietnam War, or unlike most European societies after the First World War, in both these cases, there was lots of public discussion and acknowledgement of PTSD. After the First World War, it wasn't called that way. It was called shell shock and other, but it's the same condition. Yeah? In Germany after the Second World War, and by the way also in America after the Second World War, there was actually not much talk about PTSD, like as if it didn't exist. Yeah? There was, I mean, we know that there were cases of PTSD and they were treated, but there was no public discussion about it. What does that mean? Didn't it exist, or not on a large scale basis like after the Vietnam War in America? Or did people just not talk about it? That is very difficult to decide. I would be inclined, until we know better, okay, but for the time being, my answer would be, my suggestion, my hypothesis would be that actually there was less PTSD among former German servicemen. Why so? Well, the answer is in a way given by, in part given by this author which I quoted at the beginning, Sebastian Jünger. Unlike the American society today, which basically, I mean, you know, we acknowledge, I mean, the Americans do acknowledge the service of the soldiers, but I mean, basically we don't know what to do with it, okay? The German society was so deeply involved in that war that they actually accommodated the former soldiers and responded to them and their worries relatively understandably. I mean, there were lots of conflicts and so on and problems. Yeah, that would be ridiculous to deny that. But in a way, just because the entire German society had been so deeply, including women, yeah, so deeply entangled in this war and in the Holocaust, in the carrying out of the Holocaust, there was some sort of clandestine solidarity still in the 1950s or 60s. Clandestine solidarity. And that helped the former soldiers, as strange and paradoxical as it may sound.
I'm very happy with the discussion.
Thank you
very much. And it's clear that there's a lot to talk about, so we'll just have to invite you once more to Stockton.
But see, then I would have to give the same talk, and you wouldn't like that. So.
And there's, I'm sure, a lot of answers or suggestions or issues or questions that you, Thomas, open up in the book. So it's here for $20. And thank you for coming, and thank you, Thomas, again.
Thank you all for great questions. Thank you for the discussion, and again for having me.